Yeah, I'm Rob Anda, and I'm the co-principal investigator of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And we're going to take a half an hour or so to talk about inside the ACE score, the strengths, limitations, and emerging misuses of that score. Now, what is the real power of the ACE study? It's simple, and it teaches us that ACEs are common and they're highly interrelated. They pile up and have a cumulative impact on the risk for numerous public health problems. And that's captured by the ACE score. And ACEs account for a large percentage of health and social problems. The ACE study added up 10 forms of adversity to create that ACE score. And that came from these types of adversity. First, household dysfunction, which included 5 types of adversity, including growing up with substance abuse, parental separation or divorce, mental illness, having a battered mother or witnessing domestic violence, criminal behavior as evidenced by having someone in the household incarcerated, 3 forms of abuse, emotional, physical, or sexual abuse, and neglect, emotional or physical neglect. And what we found when we added up those 10 forms of adversity and started looking at public health outcomes, we got a number of graphs that look just like this. This particular graph shows the relationship between the ACE score and ever being addicted to drugs. And we have the percentage of people who report being addicted to drugs on the vertical scale. That's the height of these red bars. And the ACE score from left to right, from 0 to 5 or more. And as you can see, as the score goes up, the risk of being addicted to drugs goes up dramatically. Here's another example. This extends the score out to 7 or 8. This is women reporting ever had a teen pregnancy based upon their ACE score. And here you see this stepwise graded dose-response relationship to teen pregnancy all the way out to ACE score 7 or 8, a continuous graded relationship. We found that ACEs have a unifying effect. Understanding them and seeing multiple graphs like this shows us that ACEs have a strong relationship to mental illness, addiction, domestic violence, disrupted families and relationships, suicide, chronic illnesses, school safety and failure, crime and mass incarceration, homelessness, health disparities, violence, and early death. The interest in this information, this data, is going up exponentially over the last few years. What I show you here is a graph showing the number of scientific publications citing the original ACE study from 2001 to 2017. It's been cited more than 32,000 times and cited in more than 150 different journals, multiple disciplines, educators, policymakers, people involved in criminal justice, public health, medicine, psychiatry, psychology. So there's diverse interest from multiple fields. And the interest in this information is going up exponentially on the internet as well. Journalists are repeatedly writing articles in local newspapers, there's radio shows, national magazines doing stories about adverse childhood experiences. So it's spreading in the lay media and on the internet. Let's talk about the strengths of the ACE score. Why is this ACE score really useful? It's a really powerful research tool for learning about the origin of public health problems. I think that's why the interest is going exponential on this. The origins of multiple public health problems and the risks are really dramatic increases. It's turned out to be a really useful tool in public health surveys, the behavioral risk factor surveys that every state does now. Almost every state has measures ACEs in their survey, and they find the same thing that we found in the original ACE study. And it's a measure to show how adversity accumulates or piles up to increase risk. And that graded dose-response relationship that you see in those bar graphs, that infers that there's some kind of underlying biology. When we see that dose response, it really infers that there's some kind of biologic process that underlies the way those graphs look the way they do. It provides a research tool for people to use that ACE score and correlate that with actual biologic measures. We've seen multiple studies showing that as the ACE score goes up, the concentration of inflammatory markers in people's blood also goes up. And I think most importantly, it provides a prevention perspective. And that perspective is that if we can reduce ACE scores from one generation to the next, we'll see a reduction in multiple public health problems simultaneously. At a personal level, I think the ACE score is a narrative or history tool where people can see presentations like this and put together their own adversity history and make sense of why their lives look the way they do, and have compassion for themselves, understanding that there's a biologic adaptation to that adversity that underlies the patterns in their lives. It's a wonderful communication tool to talk comfortably about uncomfortable experiences. We can talk about our ACE scores without having to talk about the sensitive nature of what we may have experienced. It's becoming part of a common language, and it provides this prevention framework that by reducing ACEs from one generation to the next, we can have a major public health impact. And I also believe that it's a gateway to compassion, empathy, and healing. And I think that's the foundational part of what people are calling being trauma-informed and having a trauma-informed culture. What are some of the limitations of the ACE score? And I think this is really why I'm talking to you here today. What are the limitations of that score? The questionnaires commonly used to calculate the ACE score are really crude measures of the actual exposure to the biology of adversity. About 15 years ago, I developed this one-page thing that I called Finding Your ACE Score. The purpose of that was to teach audiences like this one here today and professional audiences about, number one, what were the types of questions that we used to ask about adversity? And then I had the people in the audience fill out this questionnaire and get their own ACE score. This is a pretty accurate compilation of the original questions that we used for the actual ACE study. And what I found is in those professional audiences, the ACE scores of those audiences were always higher than the ACE score in the original ACE study. So it was a way of teaching. Number one, it's a teaching tool. How did we ask about adversity? And it also taught under controlled circumstances in presentations or seminars about ACE scores are everywhere, that it's not just people out there. And that was especially important for a professional audience to understand that ACEs are in the room. And so I developed that as a teaching tool, and it went out on the internet. And the internet being what it is, it's been adapted for uses that we need to talk about. Why is this tool and the tools that are being used adapted that are similar to this, that have taken this and modified it somewhat and being used for screening, why is it crude? The questions commonly used to measure ACEs cannot adequately assess the frequency. How many times did these adversities happen? The intensity of that experience. How intense was the adversity when it occurred? Was it chronic, that it just happened once or twice or every once in a while, or did it happen day after day, week after week, or month after month? We now know that there's gender differences in the impact of certain adversities, differences between boys and girls in the way it affects brain structure and function at different ages. And we have sensitive developmental periods growing up when certain adversities will have a greater impact on certain brain structures and function. And we also don't know what the individual variability is in stress response from asking this crude set of questions. So ACE scores are not created equal. Does that make sense? If it's a crude measure and one person fills out a questionnaire like this and another one doesn't, they have the same score, it doesn't necessarily mean that they've had the same biologic exposure to stress. So I want to give you a theoretical example of what I'm talking about. I'm going to go slow and walk you through this. This is a theoretical example that shows the relationship between a hypothetical biomarker for cumulative stress exposure and then relating that to the ACE score. So if during the ACE study we'd been able to get blood samples and there was some really precise and accurate biomarker for how much stress there was in that person's childhood, and we could plot that out, that's what I think this plot would look like. So we have the vertical scale would be what that biomarker looks like, that accurate biomarker for how much stress that person experienced during childhood. And across the bottom is the ACE scores. In this scatter plot, you see that the concentration of those biomarkers would vary pretty widely for every ACE score because that's a crude measure. We don't know frequency, intensity, severity, age at which it occurred. So let's look at, for that second scatter plot, ACE score of 1. There may have been people who had one ACE, one experience that occurred one time. Those people would have low concentrations. They'd be down at the bottom of that scatter plot. And then there might be somebody who had repeated abuse experiences throughout their childhood. They'd be up at the top of that plot. And the same would be true if we go to the right. Say, let's go to the ACE score of 6. Right? There may be some people that had 6 experiences of low frequency and intensity who would have lower concentrations of that biomarker. And there are some who would have had more frequent and severe and intense and chronic exposures who would be high on that plot. And then most people would be in that middle group, in between, somewhere around the average. So let's go back to that teen pregnancy plot. Here we see this graded relationship. And it looks really clean and smooth, and we can say that for an ACE score of 0, 15% of women had a teen pregnancy, and for an ACE score of 5, about 40% had a history of a teen pregnancy. Why does that plot look so precise like that? It's because it's an average. Right? So what I've done here is I've taken the relationship between the ACE score and a health or social problem that's represented in those sort of ghost red bars on top of the hypothetical measure, precise measure of exposure to stress. So what we see at the tops of those bars when we talk about risk is an average risk based upon how much exposure there was to the biology of stress. So ACE scores are not created equal, and it's not appropriate to apply that average risk from a big epidemiologic study to an individual person, because it's an average of that wide scatter plot of actual exposure to the biology of adversity. ACE scores have no standard, like a blood cholesterol measure or a blood pressure measure. And what we've learned in our culture is that we like to use those numbers, and that's a good thing. And we like to use those numbers because they've gone through a really intense research process. We have laboratories that standardize blood cholesterol measures. So if my blood cholesterol is 250 and you go to another lab and get a blood cholesterol 250, we're pretty sure that we're measuring the same thing. And the treatments that might be based upon that measure are based upon randomized clinical trials using a standardized measure. ACE scores don't have that kind of standardization, nor do they have the randomized clinical trials using a standardized measure to show that using the ACE scores actually has a benefit that outweighs the risk. So I'm going to talk directly from that about what I think are the current and emerging misuses of this score. The ACE score is not a diagnostic tool. It's not an appropriate screening tool because it's not standardized, and the measures being used to ask about ACEs are really crude measures. It doesn't predict risk at the individual level. It predicts risk for groups of people in epidemiologic studies. Next thing is I see out in the lay literature and in some of the treatment and screening programs that are being developed, algorithms for those, saying that there's cut points, that certain ACE scores carry certain risk, and that's illogical. Let's take a look back at how the ACE score relates to the risk of ever being addicted to drugs. For an ACE score of 0, let's call that 1%. It doubles to 2%, and then to 3%. So it doubles, triples, and quadruples up to an ACE score of 3, and then it's 10 times higher for an ACE score of 5 or more. A doubling or tripling or quadrupling of the risk for addiction, those are really big increases in risk. And I would challenge you to look at this graph or the graph on teen pregnancy and say, where is the important point where you would say this ACE score is high risk, this score is intermediate, or this score is low risk? Because the risks start going up dramatically, starting at ACE scores of 1, and they're really big increases in risk. So cut points don't make any sense to me. An ACE score of 4 or more is not a magic number. I see now out in the literature and in some of the screening programs that are being promoted to say that anybody who has an ACE score of 4 or more is at high risk. And I think the history of that is that when we were doing these studies and writing these publications, and we had this long range of ACE scores, journals only give you so much space in their journals on pages. And we had so many big tables that some of the major journals told us that we had to make our tables smaller. And so we decided to stop the ACE score at 4 or more for many of the articles that we published because we had so many results. And I think from that a false inference has been made that somehow we were implying that an ACE score of 4 or more had some kind of particular significance. And so the ACE score of 4 or more is not a magic number for assigning risk. Taking action using ACE scores as a screening tool is becoming a popular movement, and that really concerns me. I think that can lead to misuse of the ACE score to assign patients to risk categories using a crude tool that's not standardized, and to try to make decisions about clinical care and services based upon misclassification of risk. And this movement bypasses the important standards that we're used to for clinical preventive services. And we have a U.S. Preventive Services Task Force that assesses the risk and benefits of clinical services. Now, I encourage you to go to their website, uspreventiveservicestaskforce.org, and see the standard that's been applied for all of the major public health screening and treatment programs that have been used historically. And you'll see how this popular movement to use the ACE scores as a screening tool is bypassing all those standards. What are the risks of doing this, of thinking that it's a screening tool and using it as one? One is labeling. Labeling patients with a number without discussing the life context, discussion about what this really means and the education that's necessary to be really trauma-informed as a provider or to have trauma-informed clients. It can stigmatize population groups that have higher ACE scores. And one of those would be in many tribal communities, the ACE scores are much higher than other populations because of the historical trauma they've experienced. Discrimination based upon a score. If an ACE score goes into a medical record or a chart, who protects the number? How do we know that that score won't be used by companies providing insurance or by employers to make inferences about whether or not that person should be eligible to be employed or to receive a service or to change premiums? There's the risk of overestimating the risk based upon a score because it's not a precise measure. If you overestimate risk, you may refer people to treatment and services that they don't need, that not only may waste their time, but may have some risks involved. Or you may underestimate the risk based upon a score and not provide services or treatment that are needed. Popularizing ACE scores as a screening tool can compromise client and provider safety for the reasons we just reviewed. It risks creating a popular false standard that has to be unlearned and undone. As this spreads and it's adopted, it's hard to unlearn something that's considered to be the right thing to do. And it's leading to policy and legislation that assumes ACE screening is appropriate based upon the fact that someone else just did it. And that's what I mean by a popular standard. So I'm going to summarize. The questionnaires commonly used to calculate the ACE score are a crude measure of exposure to childhood adversity, and that the ACE score for that reason is not appropriate to be used as a screening tool. ACE score cut points for decision making are illogical, and the ACE score of 4 or more is not a magic number. It's a historical quirk of what journals required us to do to publish our tables in the journals. At the individual level, ACE scores can be really useful. It summarizes a personal history or narrative about our life and what we've experienced and what that means to our current circumstances. It provides a great way to communicate without revealing sensitive experiences. It carries the concepts of biologic adaptation, which are the underpinning of being trauma-informed about what adverse childhood experiences do and the risks that they generate. And it can motivate action, prevent the intergenerational transmission of ACEs. So I want to leave you with 2 key prevention questions. The ACE study was done to develop a prevention, not a treatment paradigm. Are we slowing or halting the progression of adversity within the life course? And is what we are doing in policy and practice reducing the intergenerational transmission of adversity? So I'm going to leave you with this thought. Please be a critical thinker about the strengths and limitations and misuses of the ACE score. And thank you. Thank you for your time this afternoon.
Questions